As part of the Architecture Foundation's 30th anniversary celebrations, we visited the architect Coed Hamilton at his home in Wales, a collection of buildings which have evolved over 3 decades and form his home, studio and farm. Coed is a classical architect whose work is highly tuned to its place. His home is a particularly situated architecture, encompassing restoration, new buildings and gardens, and land and animal husbandry. It's a place representing the life and work of him and his wife Diana.
We're outside the Goldhammer Mausoleum in Highgate Cemetery, one of Craig's most recently completed buildings, and we really admire his handling of the classical language to make new buildings which seem to us to embody the particular ability of classical architecture to be both universal and very particular at the same time. Craig draws from a deep knowledge of a very wide range of references, as our conversation at the farm showed, and we feel that this knowledge brings a richness to his architecture that is not often seen in much contemporary architectural output.
The word Coed Mawr means the great wood in Welsh. So what we're doing is coming through the great wood into sort of the small clearing, you know, from the medieval period, and then you get the sort of view of the drover's house, which is 1500. It actually originally went into the bank. This way, and then in the first 2 windows facing us were added in 1650, and then everything to the left of that is what we've added on.
Yeah. This is very Greek, isn't it? To have the 3/4 view on a on approach.
Yes, and of course the lime washing of the buildings is traditionally Welsh, of course, but it has so many associations with the Mediterranean and. And also, one has to find a way of making classical architecture in the most modest and the most simple form, really. So everything is brought down to just the most basic stepping of rubble stone in order to achieve a pediment.
It's almost picturesque.
It's a romantic interpretation of what we found here. It's not imposing one's will on the landscape. It's really working with what's here. The bipartite use of a column like this is a sort of assertion of the column, because you cannot ignore it. It's right in the middle, and so you have to walk. It occupies the space that a human being wants to naturally walk, which is in the middle. It's a bit like sculpture. Occupies real estate, which could, provide rental income. But the idea is redundant beauty. It's there for no other reason other than it is, a beautiful thing. Entrance areas really are dominated by the plaster casts, some copies from antiquity. These are the plaster casts coloured in terracotta from the Bow Academy.
So these were you built in, did you say 10 years ago?
Probably about 10 years ago, and the idea was that they would provide us with huge flexible spaces facing south onto the garden with good light. People are always saying classical, it's so expensive, but if you notice there are no architraves in here. We have painted architraves there, which admittedly, one has to make a full-size template, which you then paint, but it's cheaper than making, So, and then you can see the beams are just timber beams which we've run a moulding on, So there are ways of making classical architecture and profoundly simple, but at the same time still having that same resonance. It's a language which is infinitely variable. So the walls are populated also with quite a lot of Danish Golden Age artists. But the one thing that people don't know about the Golden Age painters is that they went further afield. So the top view is Segovia. You can just see the artists in the foreground sitting on a rock, like we all do, doing a sketch, you know, of Segovia in the distance. And this big painting here is Canterbury. So they came to Canterbury as well.
You've recommended buildings to us to take students to cities, and certainly people like Morpurgo.
Yes, in Rome, yeah.
Yeah, and the early 20th century, classicism in Sicily, Ragusa, and other places. So you see your travels as part of this tradition of...
Yes, I mean, you know, the moving thing is that if you have a look here, for example, there's a little drawing here which I think says it all. This is a drawing of a man with an overcoat and an umbrella and a rucksack. And at the bottom in Danish, apparently, it says left, right, left, right, left, right. And it's dated 1835, and he's walking to Rome. And then above it there's a little view of the Colosseum. And so, you know, what's wonderful is this continuity of everybody making these journeys to Rome and then coming back and doing something about it. The Soane window is obviously a very direct reference to his great window, and this faces north, so you get a gentle diffused light. And over time we've collected modest pieces of stained glass. And part of, you know, making a place is, if you're a painter as well as is to make something that's worth painting, so that you can, you know, you can paint what you see wherever you look. You know, there's something of interest that might give you, you know, and the associations, much the same as you have association between buildings outside and the landscape. Objects in a room can talk to each other in an interesting way.
Sort of understanding the relationships across centuries among close contemporaries,
Yeah.
the Danish Golden Age, across centuries to other,
Yeah.
back to antiquity,
Yeah.
forwards to yourself and this place, and architecture, sculpture, painting all together, and new work that's being made by and it's architecture and the people who've built this.
It's really like making a painting. You know, it's sort of trying things out. I mean, everything moves around as you gather things. They suggest other things to you, and you keep moving it around. And Soane did it all the time, apparently, right up to his death. You know, he was constantly shifting things around, and that's the joy of it, really. Let's keep taking a small motif and then shifting it and shaking it and moving it and breaking it and putting it back together again and reimagining it. It's not revolution, it's evolution. The whole garden really has that feeling of a Mediterranean garden in the middle of frozen, wet Wales. The statuary is museum copies from Naples and at Pompeii. So we've got the famous figure of Diana on the left, which is obviously there for a good reason, and then Apollo, her brother, and then the two little deer from Villa Porphyry.
This garden is sort of the picturesque and the formal. You know,
Yes, yes.
a very composed facade here, and then all the greenery, and then the sort of bleak view to the treasury,
Yeah.
peeking over the top of the wall.
It takes years for the growth, particularly in the sort of short summers that we have, to get to a point where we're trying to join that bit of greenery up for years, and it's finally joined up. But one is now getting a happy situation where, you know, the landscape is beginning to take a grip on the architecture.
So Craig, it took us quite a long time to get here today. It's quite a remote spot. What brought you here?
Well, it's just a long story, really, but Diana and I left South Africa in 1986, and under sort of reasonably difficult circumstances, where I was not prepared to serve in the South African army, and so we had very few choices, and one was to come to the UK, Diana's a British citizen, and I really just promised Diana that when we were ever able to replicate as best we could, then this is what we would do. So, when I started 30 years ago in my own practice, we began looking, and this little farm came up, and we drove over here on a day like today in May and fell in love with it and had no real idea of how on earth it could possibly work, and followed one's instinct, so we've been so fortunate, really. We've been able to sort of replicate in a different way what we had, a sort of way of life. For us, living in a monastery has always been a sort of most productive way of being artists, really. And because when you think of the life of a monk, it's very ordered, it's very productive, and the distractions of the outside world are removed to a certain extent, and one has surrounded by, by nature, and so that was the aim, really. Mm-hmm. It's it's testament really to all Diana's hard work, but it's there's much talk about rewilding and all of that, and I think it's a sort of understanding of how buildings in the landscape interact. Yeah, and the more columns one has associated with the more trees you have, there's a sort of happy companionship between architecture and natural form of the column, really. I mean, it's that thing of the primitive architecture, deriving from the vernacular, and also one has an opportunity to see the interaction between vernacular architecture and classical, and how the two are cousins, very close cousins, and how they can inform each other. Classical architecture is not necessarily all about sophisticated moldings and detail. It's about the understanding of materials and how they interact with the weather, which is pretty dire and gruesome in the winter, and beautiful and severe, and how they can best be used.
So we've just been speaking about your background and training, your education, and we should talk about your sort of memorial garden.
It's something which really was just an instinct to pay homage. As a classical architect, one pays homage to so many people, and it's a constant sort of dialogue with the dead, I keep saying. Biermann was, such a seminal person in my life, and I owe, a huge amount to him. I always remember poignantly the lessons from Biermann about the placing of sculpture in and around the Acropolis, and how they were specifically placed. The great figure of Athena was placed so that the great processional route would be followed in a certain way. So the drama of interacting with a building in the landscape is much enhanced by the placing of sculpture. The thing about a grave stele, which is what this is, a Greek grave stele form, and it's got a rather Hellenistic tutti frutti number, which is now wonderfully encrusted with moss.
Marriage of architecture and nature.
But they have the presence of a human being, in a sense, even though they're diminutive in scale. And you can see how they begin talking to each other. You can see the eames up on the tump over there, and then the Schinkel monument here, which was the first one that we put up. And what's rather wonderful about it is that all through the year different flowers come up, and he's surrounded by floral tributes that naturally arrive at different times of the year. the stone itself were leftover pieces of stone actually from the extension to the house, which were just very slightly tapered and is now nicely covered over with moss as well, and the runoff from the bronze.
Do you think this your keen sense of circularity or the eternal has brought clients to you? Yeah, think of mausoleum work, chapels. You know, there's something far bigger than everyday life in those commissions.
We used to be very much better at honouring the dead in actual physical terms. You know, it was quite natural to do something proper for the dead, and those wonderful cemeteries that we all know of. But it's become really very unusual to even raise the most simple tomb for somebody, and it's fair enough that some people want very modest, and you know, something like this is extremely modest as well. But it is, I think, a sign of civilization if you do commemorate the dead in some way, and in a refined way that need not be expensive, that it just remembers what has been passed on. For me, it's just very poignant, and it's a sort of natural urge in order to survive is to communicate, you know, one's gratitude to the dead every now and again. They're much more reliable as friends than